I confess I've never been upstairs and to the rare books room. And this feels like an excellent place in which to be discussing the joys and tribulations of self-reflection amidst ancient books. Why don't we just simply start with a discussion of terms? Can you tell everyone how you define an introvert and how introversion differs from shyness, which is something that I think is very often confused?
Yeah, and well, I'm going to define it in a second, but first of all, I just want to say a big hello and a big thank you to everybody for coming out tonight. And I am guessing that many of you I've actually been chatting with on Facebook and on my blog and via Twitter for the last, I don't know, it could be the last year. So thank you for coming in person, and please, when we get to the book signing at the end, will you please come up and introduce yourselves and tell me about the chats that we've been having. Remind me who you are. I'd love to meet you in person. And now I'm going to answer this question. I could actually spend like the next hour just talking about how to define introversion, because psychologists can't agree. There are as many definitions of the word as there are personality psychologists. But the definition that I use and that I think is most useful is that it's really about how you respond to stimulation. So if you are an introvert, you tend to feel at your most alive and your most energized and your most simpatico when you're in environments where there's kind of less stuff coming at you, less stimulation coming at you. By which I don't mean less intellectual stimulation, but rather just less noise, less hubbub. This is why introverts would usually rather have a nice, quiet, one-on-one conversation than be at a party full of strangers, because if you think about it, and I see some of you nodding your heads, like if you think about it, when you're at a party, you are bombarded by lots of different people, all kinds of body language to interpret. There's like a lot of stuff going on at once, and you might be very adept at interpreting all those signals that are coming at you, but you also might find it really tiring and feel like after 2 hours of having a good time, you're really ready to go home. Whereas an extrovert craves more stimulation, and when they don't get enough of it, extroverts feel like they feel bored and they feel listless. So they're the ones who are always craving more coming at them. And you also asked about shyness. Mm-hmm. So shyness is different. Shyness is much more about the fear of social judgment. It's the fear of how are people going to be thinking of me. Shy people, when they look at a face that is neutral, a neutral facial expression, they tend to attribute negative judgment to it even when it's not actually there. And I would say that though the two are different, my book Quiet is really about both states. It's about shy people and it's about introverted people, and about the value of both ways of being.
And it seems to me that one area in which introverts and shy people get into trouble is what they project or fail to project and what people read into them. So for example, extroverts say more and do more, so it's quite simply it's easier to read them, for better or worse, not to say that they're necessarily more friendly, but they're just easier to read. Whereas introverts are often mistaken for being shy, withdrawn, just simply unfriendly. Now, this is where one starts to notice something that you have called the extrovert ideal. Can you talk a little bit about why, for most of human history, introverts and extroverts and ambiverts, indeed all personality types, occupied their separate niches. Obviously there's overlap, but separate niches, trade-offs to being an introvert, trade-offs, as we know, to being an extrovert. Well, as some people know who engage in risky sex. But everyone basically coexists, and culturally, you trace it to about the dawn of the turn of the 20th century. There is this focus and this push to become more extroverted.
Yeah, so one of the things that I really wanted to figure out when I was researching the book was, is this preference in this culture, is this preference for extroversion something that is innate and that is inescapable, or is it something that's really cultural? Is it a culturally relativistic phenomenon? And the answer is really the latter, because first of all, if you look at Confucian cultures in the Far East, in China and Korea and Japan, we see cultures that are much more, not just tolerant of introversion, but that really prize introverts because they see quiet people as having the strength to be restrained and to be judicious and to hold their tongue. And it turns out that there's a kind of similar phenomenon that used to be the case in this country. I mean, a different version of it. But before the 20th century, we lived with what historians call a culture of character, where people were living in small towns. It was an agricultural economy, and people were really dependent on each other. They were dependent on the people who they had known all their lives, and so they valued each other based on each other's inner worth. You know, how good a person were you really? But then at the turn of the 20th century, we suddenly saw the rise of big business. Everybody's moving out all of a sudden into cities, needing to distinguish themselves at job interviews, on sales calls. And so all of a sudden, you had people really needing to show that they were magnetic, dominant, charismatic, alluring, this kind of thing. And that's really the heritage that we're still living with today. I think there are some changes recently, but more or less this is our cultural heritage. Can I talk about one other thing you said at the beginning?
Please, absolutely.
You know, about the way that introverts sometimes get themselves into trouble. I actually saw this phenomenon. It was really interesting to me. When I was researching my book, I reached out to a lot of personality psychologists who were studying this area, and I would usually reach out to them first by email. And by email, they were incredibly warm and welcoming. And then what would often happen was I would go to visit them in their offices and meet them in person. And they were no less kind, but they seemed much less warm in person. And that really struck me because they weren't less warm. It was just that they appeared that way.
They were harder to read.
They were harder to read, and it was harder to see their friendliness.
Not as emotive.
Yeah, not as emotive.
Even if
not as emotive.
Yeah.
And I was so struck by that because I think introverts are so often misunderstood as being not caring, not warm, not empathic, when very often it's exactly the opposite. Like they're very often people who are incredibly sensitive to other people's needs, but you can't always see it at first.
Now, you just mentioned that you do think there are very recent current changes in terms of the perception of, I'd be curious to hear from you, particularly in the tech sector, because I know you've been out to Microsoft and you've done a lot of traveling this year. What do they have to say about the extrovert ideal, if anything? Has it really infringed on Silicon Valley?
Yeah, it actually has. I actually spent a lot of time out in Silicon Valley when I was researching the book. Excuse me, and I expected to find this kind of haven for introverts. And in some ways it was, compared to broader corporate culture. But I was surprised by the degree to which introverts, even in Silicon Valley, felt these same kinds of pressures that we're talking about.
Okay, I'm sorry, not to stereotype, but
yeah, sure.
Even engineers?
Even engineers. Yeah, there's pressure on engineers to, there's pressure to work in open plan offices. There's pressure to be in team meetings much of the day. There's pressure to rise up into management positions that call on them to be pretty extroverted once they distinguish themselves. So there are all these kinds of pressures. But at the same time, it's still a much more, there's just much more latitude for personal quirks in these corporate cultures. And I would also say what's important about tech is not only the experience of the people actually working in the tech sector, but rather the impact that tech has had on the rest of us. Because we are, unfortunately, really, we are a culture that cares about the dollar, right? And so anybody who has shown that they can make a lot of money becomes the person who is respected in this culture. It's not a great thing, but it's the reality. And over the last decades, we have seen people who are quite introverted, sitting in their garages and producing large companies and large dollar values. And I think that has shifted the kind of tolerance for this style of being. But it's really, unfortunately, it's still the tolerance and the admiration for this way of being is still restricted to people who seem to have great profit potential. Right. So if you're talking about an introverted poet or artist, it doesn't really work that way. So
we can look up to them and lionize them, but we still don't necessarily want to hire the introvert, even if the tech sector has, the billionaire software geniuses, and they can, they become cultural ideals for very other reasons. One other area I'd like to ask about in terms of...
Sorry, can I interrupt you for 1 second? I do want to say, although there is this bias in the hiring process and beyond, one of the things I've been most touched by in the year since Quiet has come out has been the amazing receptivity of business leaders and educational leaders too to this message. And I truly expected the opposite, and I was kind of bracing myself for a huge critique because I was critiquing corporate policies so strongly. But people have been really receptive, and I think there is an idea. It doesn't take that much if you say, look, we're talking about a third to a half of the population. It's 1 out of every 2 or 3 people. Many of these people are incredibly bright and or incredibly creative. Okay, if you're a business leader, it is in your interest to figure out how do we make the most of these people's hearts and minds. So once you present it to them like that, they actually are really receptive. I think it's going to take a long time to see actual concrete change in widespread ways, but I believe that it can happen.
And what about business schools? You had a lot to say about them in the book, and I think you've spoken at some this year. My understanding is that there's a bit of a push towards teaching softer skills and encouraging soft power, to the point where Columbia University, Columbia's B School, the most popular course is actually taught by a man who leads meditation and really pushes people to engage in self-reflection. Do you see trends coming out of universities that maybe aren't necessarily filtering out into the workplace yet, but in terms of how students, MBAs, lawyers are being schooled?
I think we're at the very beginning of that, and that as you say, it sort of depends on the school that you're talking about. And so some of the schools have the kind of orientation that you're talking about. Some of the schools that have a more kind of quantitative, technical focus also tend to be thoughtful about these areas. But the big problem that I'm seeing in a lot of our business school teaching is that so much of it is taught. So much of the business school curriculum is taught in groups, and the group is seen as not just the ideal vehicle for absorbing lessons, but really a kind of exalted vehicle. And yet many of the people who business leaders will be graduating to manage won't want to be working all the time in groups. So I think that's the big challenge facing business school leaders and thinking about their curricula.
What is your primary critique of group work, or as you have called it, the new groupthink?
Well, I think that working in groups can be great up to a point, but I just think that we've gone haywire with it. It's lopsided by now. So I have a lot of critiques about it, much more than I can get into right now, but I'll just give you a kind of overview. Well, first of all, there's a lot of people who just don't work at their best when they're in a group, so you're losing out on those people right from the start. But for everybody, there's 40 years of research in group brainstorming that has found consistently over and over again that individuals who brainstorm by themselves, like go off by yourself and try to think of the answer to a problem, you will produce more ideas and better ideas than a group of people brainstorming together. And it's kind of crazy because the studies find this over and over again, and business leaders are told about it, and yet group brainstorming continues to be a kind of central vehicle of business practice. And I think that one of the reasons for this is that there is one great benefit to group brainstorming, and that is social cohesion. It does foster morale. People who have been involved in a group brainstorming process tend to feel as if they've come up with really great ideas, even if they actually haven't. They feel as if they have, and that's valuable. I mean, it is. It sounds kind of funny, but it is. But I think we have to be really clear about what the value is there. It's the value of social cohesion. It's not the value of actually generating a great solution to a problem. So we need to be more clear-eyed.
Well, there is a fair amount of research arguing that the most creative people actually shift very easily between solo work and group work. I believe that's Sheikh Sent Me High, whom you quote at length. So you argue, I think, that group work can be, the sting of it can be mitigated by breaking off, or?
Yeah, I mean, I really argue for a kind of hybrid process where if you had a problem to solve or something creative to generate, I would advocate sending everybody off by themselves to do their own solitary thinking, thought process, and then come together with a group, and then keep toggling back and forth between the two. And I think that hybrid idea can be applied in so many different ways. Like if you're thinking about office spaces, I think we should have office spaces that encourage lots of casual interactions for people to chat in really non-threatening, casual ways, but also lots of nooks and crannies for people to go off and be by themselves.
What do people who crave these very conditions but don't have access to them in their day-to-day life and in their workplace do?
Yeah, this is such an important question. And I think that the real answer is that, first of all, before you talk about anything concrete, you have to start with a sense of entitlement to be who you are and get the solitude that you're looking for. So, for some people that means going out and taking a walk a couple times a day by yourself, or if your office has these nooks and crannies, to go and seek them out in some kind of a proactive way. Like, there are a lot of offices where you can sign up in advance to use the private room in the back. And so make sure to actually sign up for it. And I talk to people, and they tell me that they feel guilty about going out and taking a walk or that kind of thing. So I think the most important thing is, to banish that guilt and to know that you're not only serving yourself, but you're serving your colleagues and your employers when you get that restoration.
And what about the trickier but important aspect of self-change? In other words, we can't always change our environment, so we have to also conform to it. And this is something that you've done incredibly well in all of your careers. You actually were spurred to become a Wall Street lawyer. If I understood your TED Talk correctly, you, in some ways, to challenge yourself, you wanted to develop a more aggressive aspect. Am I characterizing that correctly?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think there was a part of me that felt like I needed to, for whatever reason, like I needed to prove to myself that I could do it, that I could thrive in an environment that was seen as very hardcore. And, I don't know, I went to law school for a million different reasons. But yeah, I think it is important to be able to develop that side of yourself, to just kind of have it in your toolbox so that you can use it when you need to.
So how do people, how does one both accept one's own nature and push against the boundaries of one's natural temperament? And I believe Brian Little, an amazing professor whom you profile at length in the book, has an interesting theory about this.
Yeah, so Brian Little, he's this amazing guy. If you ever have the chance to hear him speak, I mean, really don't miss it. He's a world-class public speaker. He standing ovations everywhere he goes. Excuse me. He's also one of the kindest people you will ever meet. And despite being this world-class public speaker, he's a really strong introvert who says that when he's done with every talk, he immediately races to the restroom when he's done because he can't bear to actually sit and have chit-chat afterwards. He's depleted by the time he's done on stage. So he spent a lot of time thinking about exactly this question, and he says it makes sense to act out of character in this way when you're doing it for the sake of something that you love. So if it's work that you love, or if it's a person that you love, then it makes sense to kind of push yourself outside of your natural comfort zones. And I would kind of add to that and say it's not only that it makes sense then, but in some ways that's the only way you'll ever really be able to do it effectively, in my experience. I mean, I found when I was a lawyer and had to do these presentational things, I got through it, but I was much less good at it, and it was a lot harder for me than it has been in the last year when I've been out talking about this book, which I care about so passionately. It's like a completely different world. So if any of this resonates for you, I would say, in a way, use this idea as a kind of check for whether you are on the right path in your career and in your life in general. I mean, if you feel yourself too often being called upon to stretch yourself and to be outside your comfort zone in the service of something or someone who you don't care about that much, then you're on the wrong path. and you'll find it much easier to push yourself when it is something that matters so deeply.
Actually, I would love to talk about careers and career change for a moment, because you had a very dramatic career change that sort of brought you into this, and I think people here may be interested in hearing a little more about that. What spurred you to sort of transition out of the law and into consulting and then on to book writing?
Well, it's funny because, okay, so I wanted to be a writer since I was 4 years old, is what I always wanted to do. But I don't know, I graduated from college and I was quite sure that that was just kind of, the impractical dream of youth and not something that was real at all. So I went off to law school and truly, honest to goodness, forgot about it. And then after 7 years of practicing law, I took a leave of absence, having no idea what I was going to do. I was just kind of burnt out from working 16-hour days. And I found myself, I thought I'd probably travel or something. That's like the thing people do when they take a break. But I found myself within 24 hours, it was so strange, within 24 hours I was signing up for a creative writing class at NYU, a course in creative nonfiction. And I went to this class and I sat there on the first night of the class and I was like, this is it. This is absolutely what I want to be doing, and I am going to reorganize my entire life so that I can do this. And I thought at that point that the chances of my actually publishing something were like this big. I really didn't, because you hear about how hard it is to break in as a writer. So I told myself, okay, if you can publish something by the time you're 75, then you're okay. And in the meantime, this is just going to be this great hobby. So I set up a little consulting business on the side just to have something to pay the bills. And the rest of the time, I was writing every chance that I got. And I did that for about 4 years and wrote all kinds of things before I ever came to this book. I wrote a memoir in prose and another version in sonnet form. There was a while that everywhere I went, I was carrying a rhyming dictionary around with me. Oh, thank you. Yeah, and I never tried to publish any of that. And then suddenly I came to the idea of this book about 4 years in, and it was kind of clear this was the one that I was going to try to publish. And I have to say, at that point, there was a member of that writing class that I had taken at the very beginning who I told about the idea for this book, and she said to me, when you're ready, when you have a book proposal written, I know the perfect literary agent for you. And that literary agent was named Richard Pine, who is sitting here right now. And I owe my career to him, and I owe this book to him. It wouldn't have happened without him. He got it right away, and has been an incredible partner throughout my whole career. And it probably wouldn't have happened if I hadn't happened to have taken that class at NYU. So thank you.
It's always cool to hear the stories of how serendipitous the path is in some ways, and yet in other ways it's somewhat preordained in that you, as you stated, you wanted to be a writer from a very young age. And you say something very honest, I think, in the book, and that is that one should pay attention to what one envies in others. I think a lot of people feel that intuitively but don't want to admit it to themselves.
Yeah, I did talk about this in the book, the incredible instructive power of envy. I used to notice when I was a corporate lawyer that I would sit around with my lawyer friends, and they would be talking, with obvious envy, really, of some classmate of ours who had gone on to argue before the Supreme Court, or I don't know what they had done, some great accolade in the world of law. And I realized that I was like, oh, more power to them. Good for them. That's so great. And at first I thought, well, I must be a really generous person because it's all good with me. But then I started to realize that there were people who I envied, and those people were writers. And their lives seemed so incredibly far away to me and so untouchable and so unreachable, but I envied them. And yeah, that was instructive.
I'd like to ask you also about what is very much a requirement of being a writer these days, and that is the public speaking and self-promotional aspect of it. How you had a very unique way of approaching this. Your year of speaking dangerously. Would you talk a little bit about how you desensitized yourself, acclimated to circumstances like this and larger groups as well?
Yeah, well, okay. So I was working on this book since 2005, right? And it came out in 2012, so that's a lot of time. That's 7 years. And all that time, people were saying, gosh, aren't you tired of working on the same thing for all this time? And I would say, no, I'm really not. And part of the reason was that I was completely obsessed with it. And I never, ever tired of the subject matter or of the process of writing. But part of it was, to be honest, I was kind of dreading the moment when the book would come out and I would actually have to go and do these kinds of things and be out in public.
Sorry.
So it was fine with me to put that off. But I knew that I had to be ready when the time came. And so I knew it was time to finally face down my fear of public speaking. I had been speaking before that. It was just always this source of horror and terror for me. So in the year before the book came out, I embarked on what Kaja just told you, my year of speaking dangerously. And I practiced public speaking every chance I could get. And I tried to practice in settings that were very low stakes, very supportive, where it really didn't matter how nervous I seemed or how I was coming across. And that's really the key, because you need to be able to practice in environments that are not incredibly anxiety-making. And in fact, I actually started in this one class that is in New York, for those of you who are interested, and it's for people with public speaking anxiety. And it's run by a guy named Charles DeCagno. And what he would do, he would have people do these exercises, speaking exercises, and before each one, before you did it, he would ask you, okay, what's your anxiety level on a scale of 1 to 10? And the ideal was if you were somewhere like between 3 and 6. But if it was too high, you shouldn't be doing the exercise at all, because then you're not learning anything. You're just kind of encoding the sense of horror. But so he starts people off with really simple stuff, like just stand up in front of the room and say your name. Stand up in front of the room and have people ask you questions like, where do you live and where did you go to school? Really easy to answer things. And gradually that comes to seem normal and acceptable, and the fear over time dissipates. It doesn't ever go away completely, but it truly gets to the point where it's just not an issue. And really, I used to be somebody who lost sleep, lost pounds, all of it.
Wow. Related question: how has the blogosphere? Online generally, but specifically the blogosphere, sort of opened new horizons for more introverted, reserved types in terms of self-promotion?
This is such a tricky question, because I know a lot of people say to me that they're really uncomfortable, particularly introverts, but I think everybody is a little uncomfortable with the self-promotion that is called upon now of writers or anybody who's kind of out there in public. But I have found it to be a great medium, and I know many other people who have, because if you think of it not in terms of self-promotion, but just of a chance to connect with people and express things to people, from the comfort of your own home, it's actually an amazing, amazing boon.
Yes, and in fact, I think that was not the best chosen phrase with its self-promotion.
No, but I think it's a real issue. I think people feel it.
And I think, and even people who are not trying to put themselves out, out there as artists, creative types. I think there is this question of what should one's online identity, and I hate to use the term, but this is now the term, one's personal brand be. I think there's pressure in many fields to brand oneself. We see it at Psychology Today. We have over 1,000 bloggers. And one thing I've noticed purely anecdotally is that I think the more reserved, quiet, introverted types actually do not stick to social media as much. Again, this is anecdotal, I don't want to make too much of it, but I wonder if there is a way in which there is something lacking in that medium for people who crave deeper and more engaged intellectual stimulation often, and whether for that reason, in fact, introverts are underrepresented and have a smaller social media footprint than we actually realize.
I don't know. From the studies I've seen, introverts are not as represented in a place like Facebook,
Right.
which really does emphasize a kind of superficial self-presentation and sort of superficial exchanges. Although I have to say, for those of you who I've been chatting with on Facebook, not superficial at all. It's been great. What was I going to say? Oh, yeah, but I think there actually are a lot of introverts out there using other kinds of social media really effectively, and for that reason. And for those of you who are thinking about it, I think if you just think of it as a chance to kind of put out there whatever you're thinking, you end up finding the like-minded people, out in the great big blogosphere. They will find you, you will find them. So it becomes this amazing place. I mean, one of the things I love, I'm the kind of person, if I read a book or see a movie or hear music that I really love, I'm dying to share it right away. And usually I'll call up 1 or 2 or 3 friends or tell my husband. But it's amazing to actually be able to post something online and find all these other people who love the same thing that you love or hadn't known about it before, but then they write and tell you how much they loved it too. So that kind of thing I think is incredibly gratifying.
I want to switch gears and ask you about your grandfather, if I may. You write and speak so incredibly movingly about him. I must say that your note about your dedication brings tears to my eyes, even in the rereading. Really, it's very powerful. And would you share with people who don't know his story and your family's story? Would you share a little bit about him? Because I think in some ways he embodies an introvert ideal, could we say, in some ways?
Yeah, it's funny, I've actually never thought of using that phrase to apply to him, but that's exactly right. Thank you. So my grandfather, he was this incredibly beloved figure. I mean, for me and for my family and for his community, really. He was a rabbi, and he lived in Brooklyn. He lived in a small apartment in Brooklyn. He was a widower. He lived alone, and this apartment was filled with books. And it's funny, I look back on it now from my adult vantage point. It was a very modest, very unassuming apartment. But to me, as a kid, it was like a palace. It was this amazing place that was filled with his very, very gentle presence, and books everywhere, like on every wall and on every table, and he would sit and he would take those books and be reading them and thinking about how he was going to weave them together. And then for his sermons, which he gave a couple every week, and these sermons were this weaving together of ancient thought and humanist thought, and people would come from all over, to hear him. And he was not a classically dynamic speaker, yet people could feel the value of what he was bringing. And so, I'll just tell you more about the way he spoke. And I spoke about this in my TED Talk, if any of you have seen this, so sorry I'm repeating it a little bit. But he was the kind of speaker, he actually had trouble making eye contact with people because he was shy. He'd been looking out at these people for 64 years. That's how long he was a rabbi, but he was still shy about making eye contact with them. But it didn't matter. It didn't matter. And I think that we nowadays have this idea that there's only one kind of leader. But in fact, when he died, when he was 94, the police had to close down the streets of his neighborhood for all the people who came out to mourn him, who weren't going to hear those sermons anymore. And so for me, I was incredibly, incredibly lucky to grow up in a family where this was normal and this was revered to be this way. And I used to tell him that I wanted to be a writer, and for him that was the greatest thing. Like, I wish, my mother says this all the time, I wish he could be here to see this. Excuse me.
Thank you for sharing that. That's a question about is there one bit of the many strands of research that you've woven into this book? Is there one bit of research or even one bit of self-discovery, I suppose one could call it, that you use daily? And I'm naming those two poles because I feel that your book is a beautiful blend of both, of discovery, scientific discovery, and self-discovery, and heart and brains. Is there one sort of nugget that you find yourself going back to again and again?
Oh my gosh. So I'm going to think of the answer to this question after you've all gone home. Like the minute the last person has left, I will remember the answer or think of it.
It's a fairly broad question in your defense.
I don't know. So I don't have a specific answer, I guess. I guess what I would really say is that through living this stuff since 2005, as I have, I truly have come to the point where I feel completely comfortable about making the daily choices that I do. And so, those choices are not going out on New Year's Eve, because I'd really much rather hang out at home with my husband, and he's cool with that too. And that kind of thing. I mean, I love the network of friends that I have, but they've actually come to understand that I don't see them that much, because I don't know, I'm spending so much time with work and with my family, and that's really actually what makes me happy. And I guess I don't question it. I don't question those daily choices so much, and I think that's actually really hard. I think that's really hard. I think most of us grow up feeling like, there's a party out there, you really should be going to that party. And I'm not actually advocating being a total hermit, although it might sound like I am. I really don't think that's the route to happiness. I think figuring out some whatever amount of social interaction makes you happy, and sticking with that and not going beyond that.
I think you're actually far from advocating being a hermit. I think you're describing a very natural human trajectory, which is to become more introverted with age.
Yeah,
and I don't know if anyone here
too.
has noticed that about themselves, but that's actually a well-established fact.
Yeah. No, that's true. That's true. I actually think about it, like when I was in high school, I remember spending hours on the phone with my friends after school, and I can't imagine for the life of me doing that now. I don't know if you've all noticed the same path.
Yes, indeed. No time, but frankly also not the same amount of interest. I do see, though, in scanning the audience, that there are people here who probably have questions as well.
Yeah, and I want to encourage you, you can ask me anything. It doesn't have to be related to what we've just talked about. It could be in any topic that strikes you.
Oh, there's got to be a question there.
Hi, thank you very much. I really enjoyed reading your book.
Thank you.
And I'm a rabbi, so I relate to some of those experiences.
Thank you.
One of the things I was interested, a lot of the discussion has been about introverts and extroverts in the corporate arena and how they interact. I was wondering if you talk a little bit about in the relationship arena and the challenges between introverts and extroverts.
Yeah, and I should say, I actually have a whole chapter of the book that is devoted to this exact subject, because I think it's so important. And there are a lot of introvert-extrovert relationships and marriages. Which makes sense if you think about it, because the two types tend to be attracted to each other. There's this sense of each one completing the other. But I also, for my book research, I interviewed many of these couples, and I started to see a pattern of the kinds of conflict that come up again and again and again. And I'll tell you, the first one is, I guess, what I was alluding to before. It's the question of, well, how often as a couple are you going to go out? If you have one person whose vision of the perfect Friday night is sitting at home on the sofa snuggling, and the other person wants to throw a big dinner party for all your friends, well, how do you navigate that challenge, really? And it comes up day after day and week after week. So my advice for that one is to really figure out some kind of a system that is going to work for you as a couple across the board, so that you're not having to negotiate it out week after week. So maybe you say, okay, every Friday night we're going to stay in, and every Saturday night we're going to go out, or whatever works for you as a couple. The idea, the key is to figure it out in advance. The other thing that is really important for couples to understand is that introverts and extroverts approach conflict very differently. And we tend not to realize that this has to do with our basic temperament, because you think of introversion and extroversion as being only about how social you are, but it has so many other dimensions. So introverts tend not to like conflict very much, and their attitude, their response to conflict is often to kind of to try to diffuse it and to speak in very low and even tones, to try to almost act like it's not really happening. And extroverts tend to be the opposite. They're what psychologists call confrontive copers. They're more in your face about conflict. And this can lead to really dreadful misunderstandings, because an introvert can feel aggressed by an extrovert's more in-your-face approach, and they can feel like, well, if you really loved me, you would not be coming on so strong and hurting my feelings in this way. But an extrovert can feel exactly the opposite. They can feel like, wow, if you really loved me, you would be engaging in this conflict more deeply. You would be sitting down and really hashing this out with me. You would care enough to get to the bottom of this. You wouldn't try to be sweeping it under the rug. You wouldn't try to be minimizing it. So if you think about it, like, starting off the sentence, if you really loved me, that's huge. And it can help so much to just have the self-awareness and the awareness of your partner to know it's not that they don't love you when they address a conflict in this way that is so alien to you. It is just their temperament, and you need to figure out ways to accommodate each other.
It's kind of related. I was just going to ask if your husband's an introvert.
It's so funny. Okay, so I always say my husband's an extrovert because if you met him, you'd see, like, you go to a party with him, he's kind of at the center of things. He reads like an extrovert, but he says he's an ambivert, and that may actually be true, because this conflict I was just talking about of how much do you want to go out, my husband and I don't actually have this conflict. Even though he seems like someone who would want to be going out all the time, and I think he probably was that way when he was younger, but he's actually quite happy to spend many nights sitting at home, and if we go out too many nights in a row, he'll say, wow, that's been a lot, and now we should stay home. But yeah, in general, I would say we have a kind of introvert-extrovert pairing.
Hi. I thought it was really interesting how you described your journey from law to book writing, and I was wondering how you came upon this topic of introversion, and whether, as you were growing up, did you always identify as one? Did you feel that? And I also think it's really interesting because I think you're a parent, and kind of seeing your children and how you identify or maybe don't identify with your kids, and how you've kind of raised your children with that those glasses on, I guess. And I feel like that could be a whole book in and of itself.
Yeah, how did I get to this topic? I don't know. I think I've been really getting ready to write this book again since I was 4 years old. I've been noticing these social dynamics since then, and obviously I didn't have a language for them when I was a kid, but I would guess for many of you, if you're introverts here, you can remember pretty vividly the times you thought about this stuff as a child, of being at school or being in camp or wherever, where the activities were very boisterous and very group-oriented, and it maybe didn't suit you, but you had this, you could understand very early on that you were supposed to go along with that program. So I've been thinking about it since then, and then I became a corporate lawyer, and I started looking around, and I kind of came into law assuming that the best lawyers were going to be the bold and swashbuckling people, but saw to my surprise that many of my colleagues who were the best lawyers were the quiet and the reflective and the thoughtful ones, who could, I was a corporate lawyer, I did deals, I wasn't a litigator, so like, if you're doing a deal, being able to see what's coming next, being able to quietly form bonds with people can actually be incredibly useful. So I started noticing all this stuff and realizing that there was no language for it. We talk about gender and we talk about race. We never talk about personality, really, even though it's just as fundamental to who we are.
Any more questions? No.
In the last probably 10 years, emotional intelligence has been just a huge topic. And while there's all this research, Daniel Goleman and a number of other people on how people with emotional intelligence actually are more successful, I know certainly in my corporate experience, it always hasn't been something that's been either focused on or valued. And when I was reading...
Sorry, has been or has not been?
Has not been.
Okay.
And it feels like it's something that is starting to be incorporated a little bit more in, but I thought about that a lot in reading your book, and I was just wondering if it's something that you thought about, or you worked with any of that research, or saw any correlation at all.
Yeah, I have thought about it some. And I think what's important to think about is the different ways of expressing emotional intelligence, because I think it often is seen as being something that's in the domain of extroverts who do that thing I was talking about at the beginning of immediately being very warm and outreaching in ways that introverts don't do. But what I've come to see is that there really are different ways of expressing emotional intelligence. And I'll give you an example from a letter that I just got from someone, a guy who is an introvert who's a salesman at an electronics manufacturer, a retailer, I'm sorry, and he was saying that the ethos of this company is very peppy, and they have these big, let's get jazzed sessions every morning before they start the day, and they're supposed to be very jazzed up when they're talking to the customers. And he said he takes a much more empathy-based approach. And the other day he was talking to a woman whose husband had recently died, and she had brought in her cell phone and needed to change phones, and was starting to cry as she asked whether the voicemails from her dead husband could be transferred over to the new phone that she was about to buy. And so this salesman was sitting empathically with her, helping her through this. And at this very moment, his colleague came up and started high-fiving this woman, and telling him, not because he was cruel or stupid. He hadn't even realized, he hadn't seen the tears in the woman's eyes, because the default mode was, let's do this big warm thing, or seemingly warm thing. So I think it's important to understand there's a lot of different ways of connecting.
Oh, here.
Michael, hi.
Oh, here.
You
Here,
too.
I'll give you this. Wow, here. There you go.
Oh, pardon me. How has your consulting offering changed or shifted from the body of work and knowledge you had before you wrote the book to now? Because you're seeing the world through new eyes, and I'm wondering if your consulting offering has changed, and when you're in those engagements, are you looking for and finding different things?
Well, I guess it's changed just because the nature of my consulting has changed. So before I wrote this book, I trained people in negotiation skills, based on what I had learned as a lawyer. And I'm not really doing that now. Now I'm much more going around and speaking to companies about these issues. So it's kind of changed right off the bat, just in terms of the subject matter. And I would say I'm really still feeling it out. This is all new. It's just in the last year that I've started going around and speaking about this.
Hi. Sorry. There are a lot of personality tests out there that say you're introvert, extrovert, whatever, and then maybe that leads you to a certain career. Do you believe in those kind of tests, or do you think that actually has any value to take those kind of tests, or do you think that you should go to a certain career because you're an introvert or an extrovert?
Well, I actually do really like those tests, but I would say for the introvert-extrovert question alone, it's tricky. I would more be guided by what is the thing that you really love to do, and what is the thing you really care about doing, and whatever that thing is, you will figure out a way to make it work in an introverted way or in an extroverted way. I think that's probably more important. But I will say for the personality tests in general, I'm actually a big fan of them, and it was when I was a lawyer that I stumbled across them for the first time. I stumbled across the Myers-Briggs test. How many of you are familiar with Myers-Briggs? Okay, so most of you. I had never heard of it until then, and I came across this book called Do What You Are, which helps you figure out what your personality type is, and then what the right career might be for you based on that type. And I have to say that changed everything for me. It was like this moment of blinding clarity where I understood this is why I really don't want to be a lawyer, and this is why I should be doing something completely different. And then it was interesting because there are 16 different Myers-Briggs types, and I was looking at what the income levels are for the 16 types, and the type I am had the very lowest income level of all of them. And it was an interesting moment because, at that point I was living in the world of corporate law, which is for whatever its faults, it's a world where you don't have to worry so much about your income. And I thought, okay, what does it mean to actually shift in this direction? But I knew that was what I really wanted to do.
Any more questions?
Oh, can I just say one more thing about this? Just in terms of that there really are ways to make your passion work regardless of your style. So the type I am, for those of you who are MBTI people, is an INFP. So it's a kind of, I don't know, it's sort of a soft type. It's like the people who become writers and psychologists and social workers. But I had the honor to meet a Marine general, General Charles Krulak. He was the commandant of the entire U.S. Marine Corps during the 90s. And he's an INFP, he was telling me. And he was beloved by the people who he led, in part because he described himself as having a kind of mother-hen approach to Marine Corps leadership. So, if he doesn't prove that point, I don't know who does.
I have a double question. I studied to be a priest, and they trained us to sing at Mass and as a member of the choir. And sometimes, because I no longer am a priest and I didn't go on to be ordained, when I go to Mass on Sundays, I know how to sing very well. And I notice that the congregation joins in very, very nicely, though they don't know that I'm the creator in a sense.
Oh, that's fabulous.
But at the same time, though I have that ability, I don't seem to have the extroverted type of personality when I'm talking to friends at a dinner party or something like that. But there is a priest that I know once when we did have a dinner and there were several people there, and I noticed that no one was really talking that much. But before you knew it, after the dinner was finished and people were starting their dessert, he started to discuss about different things that were in the news. And he was so forceful and so entertaining and so extroverted that, we were all amazed. But of course, some of his friends who knew he was this well in speaking at parties and sermons. And I just want to know, why is it that, I cannot do that, but I can get, extroverted in leading people to sing? Is there a solution there, or why I cannot be better as a talker, a speaker, or a sermonizer?
Well, gosh, that's a whole lot of things in one. It's very common for people to feel like they are they're one way in one situation and another way in another. That's not surprising at all. And I think that's fine unless it bothers you and unless you really feel like you do want to be the talker in these situations. And
it's not that cold. There are kinds of times when I do speak very well.
Yeah.
But I notice that there are times, no, I really just seem to be not that efficient.
Not that efficient at speaking, yeah.
And I taught history too. So I had to speak in a way.
Right. So in some situations you could do it, and in others you couldn't. Yeah, I mean, actually Carl Jung, who was the psychologist who first popularized the idea of introversion and extroversion, he talks about this as being the hallmark of an introvert, that in certain situations, he describes it as they relax into extroversion, but in other situations not. Yeah, and I see you nodding your heads because that's something I think many people relate to. But I also want to say, I think there's something really beautiful about the idea of you getting all these people to sing without people even realizing that you were the one who was doing it. There's something really inspirational about that.
They see that I have that ability and that gift. Someone here, and then, everyone begins to hear everyone singing well, and they just pick it up and do it very well.
I just, it's just by way of analogy, I just read a story about a guy whose name I'm now forgetting. It's Thomas something, so I apologize for not knowing his name. But anyway, he was a Japanese diplomat in World War II. I think he was stationed in Lithuania, and he defied the orders of the Japanese government and issued I think it was thousands of visas to Jews to get them out of the country and into Japan. And he later got into terrible trouble for doing it, and his family was poverty-stricken, and he died in disgrace. And nobody even really knew about his story. We hear about Raoul Wallenberg, and we hear about Oskar Schindler. this man has saved just as many people, and we don't really hear about his story in part because he lived under a kind of code of modesty, and he had grown up with a code of Bushido, I think it was called, which is kind of like the samurai code, which has to do with chivalry and with modesty. And I found something really inspiring about the idea that he wasn't looking for any kind of recognition, even decades after he had done this act. There's something really beautiful about that.
Let's take one more question, if anyone has a question. No? Oh, yes.
I enjoyed your book very much.
Thank you.
In psychology and in psychotherapy, there's this notion that introversion is a sort of a disturbance in some ways. So the goal is to work to get out of it. I was wondering if you thought that there might be some way to look at the introversion as disturbability, in that, say, an extrovert might be okay at a bar, whereas the introvert tends to get inundated with stimuli. And so is there a way to look at introversion as, well, how do we distinguish introversion as disturbance and introversion as talent?
Yeah, well, first of all, in terms of the tendency of psychology to look at introversion as a disturbance or as a pathology, this is true, and this absolutely stunned me when I first started researching this book, because I had just assumed that, if there was one corner of our society that got it about introversion, it would be psychologists, many of whom are introverts themselves. I don't know the statistics, but it's a lot of them. And yet this is not true. It is seen as a pathology. And in fact, at first when I started trying to research the scholarly articles on introversion, I couldn't find anything, and I thought, this is really weird. There must be something out there. It turns out they're all filed under extroversion, because introversion is seen as just the lack of extroversion in psychology. Literally, it is the lack of it. So that's a huge problem. I think there's hope of it change. Oh, and I should tell you too, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is like the Bible for psychologists and psychiatrists of mental disturbance. They've been revising it, and there was a move afoot to include a new category for introversion. So it would have been codified as a pathology, but luckily many people shouted this down, and it's not actually happening. So yeah, I think there's a lot of change that needs to happen there. I don't think I would use the word disturbability, though, to describe introverts. I think these are really culturally normative terms, and you could say the same thing about extroverts too. You could say extroverts are easily disturbed when they're left alone in a room by themselves. I know this. Many extroverts come up to me and they say, how can I get some of this introversion? Like, I have a project I want to finish and I can't be alone by myself to do it, or I sense it would be good for me to spend more time meditating or reading or just sitting and thinking, and I can't do it. But we don't tend to focus on that so much as we focus on the person who doesn't talk enough at dinner parties. And I think we should really rather understand that both of these ways of being have their pros and cons. They just do. No way of being has all the advantages.
Thank you both so much. Thank you. Unless there's one more question that needs to be answered, it's okay. We have time. No? Okay. Well, thank you. What a lovely evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kaya. Thank you.